know what time it is? Riot Started TV time. We're in the building on Black Power Media Live. Now, I said I wasn't doing no more lives this week. Said I wasn't sitting in front of no damn computer. I wasn't having it, so on and so forth. But I see the enemy is in overdrive and we need clarity. So yesterday I was like, look, who can I call on to put this shit to rest and to provide a concrete analysis so we won't be playing no games and running around talking about why black folks should be involved and all this other stuff or whatever. So I called on two of my favorite MCs. You know what I'm saying? Two of my favorite movement MCs, my top five. But before I go there, I want to say that I represent the FTP movement. And as part of the FTP movement, one of our campaigns, one of our current campaigns is Liberation Housing. You can check it out at thenaturalfestival.com/Liberation Housing. And what Liberation Housing is about, we're working on an effort to prepare some type of safety net for our OGs and our veterans because of the fact that oftentimes they're forgotten about and they're trotted around like there's some type of project or experiment. So we want to make sure that we keep that thing going. Okay, so definitely, if you have the ability and have it in your soul and your heart and all that, support our efforts. Now, what I would like to do is thank you all. If it's your first time logging on, this is Black Power Media. We've been in existence for a year and several days. And our efforts is to make sure that we're on the right side of the barricades, politically, physically, mentally, and spiritually. But without further ado, what I would like to hit you all with is a very brief bio. I have two movement veterans on deck today. One is a veteran of the Black Panther Party and the BLA, is a former political prisoner. The other is national organizer of the Black Alliance for Peace, aka BAP, and he's been putting in a whole lot of work throughout the years. He told me not to say one of the things that he was involved in, but before the show over, you know, I'm just my father said I'm hard-headed, so I'm gonna have to slip it in there at some point. But anyway, without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Dhoruba Bin Wahad and Ajamu Baraka.
All right.
What's happening? How y'all feeling?
Feeling good, feeling good, feeling good and honored.
Cool.
Man, look here, man. I feel like I'm in the middle of a felony right now.
You might be.
With you two cats, man. Man, I'm definitely you know, honored to have you both on deck at the same time. I thought it would only be right to really just hit it from as many angles as possible. And I know that both of you are extra busy, and you know, so I just wanted to get to it. Our topic today, we know that we know about the whole situation with Russia and the Ukraine and the US, and we know all the confusion behind it, and we know that that we're all over the place in regards to thinking as far as a quote unquote community. So I would like to get it started by with the first question saying what role does NATO, the EU, and the US play in the Russia-Ukraine conundrum? And we can start with either one of you.
Well, you go first, Ajamu.
Yeah.
I think, yeah. Go on. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's going to be brief. You know why? Because what role they play is the whole role is all about the EU, NATO, and the US. It's all about the US attempting to try to keep the European market under its control, utilizing the military structure of NATO, but also utilizing other instruments it has in hand. So this whole thing about, I mean, Ukraine is just the entry point, okay? But it's all about the U.S. commitment to, you know, what they call the doctrine of full spectrum dominance. So that's the ball game. That's it. I mean, it's about U.S. imperialism. It's about a global economic competition, and all of the contradictions that flow from that.
Right on. You want to add on to that, Dhoruba?
Well, for sure. You know, in understanding the history of this, NATO was created ostensibly after World War II to halt and put in check any Soviet Union. Then Russia was the Soviet Union. Then any Soviet Union military aggressions in Western Europe, where the lines were drawn after 1945 and the surrender of the Nazi Germany and the division of Europe. Now, a number of states came into existence then, but most of the Eastern Europe came under the sway of the Soviet Union, the so-called Soviet bloc nations. And so this was the height of the Cold War. They talked about the Iron Curtain and everything. So NATO was created to prevent the so-called aggression of Soviet Union. And now when the Soviet Union collapsed in the 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the negotiators of the collapse of the Soviet Union, they were guaranteed that NATO would not take advantage of their withdrawal from Eastern Europe, from the dissolution of the Soviet bloc nations, giving them independence, and Poland and all of these different nations, and the NATO alliance and the U.S. agreed. But at the same time, 6 months, 8 months later, they began to encroach on these other nations, promising them deals and money and inclusion into the EU. And many of them took the bait. And the Soviet Union then was breaking up. It was too weak to do anything. But they had drew the line with Georgia, the Ukraine, Crimea, and the Balkans. They drew the line there. They said, if you try to put NATO and missiles into these areas, into these nations, and turn their economics towards the EU and make them pro-Western and anti-Russian, that's a direct threat to Russia, and we're going to react, and you're not going to like the reaction that we're going to do, because it's going to destabilize the whole of the European Union security. And they said this, in what, 2008 at the Bucharest summit. Putin said this. And he offered a deal. He said, well, instead of, let's keep Ukraine neutral, let's keep these nations on our borders neutral, and we will offer $10 billion and keep making the economy, bringing up the economy, bringing up the standard of living of these people, so that they wouldn't look to the West as something that they should deal with economically, because they were privately trying to deal with the West, with ex-naying the Russians out, So Putin made this clear back then. This is 2008, I think, in Bucharest. So this conflict that we're seeing now continues, because after 2008, NATO and the EU began to move their missiles and their military further and further towards the frontiers and the borders of Russia, and that's the auspices of this. And then and then they tried to this Orange Revolution that they engineered, the coup that led to the current political elite in the Ukraine. They engineered this coup, and the Russians, they told them that they were going to react like this. So they precipitated this move, and they tried to portray Putin and the Russians, and that's not to say these vodka drinking Russians are any sweet deal on anything, but nonetheless, they have always began to support liberation movements and the arming and the training of liberation movements, which of course the U.S. and the West have problems with. So we need to understand that when Ajamu talks about full spectrum dominance, that NATO and the EU need the U.S. They need the U.S. military alliance. They need the U.S. economic alliance and trade. And so that NATO, which shouldn't exist anymore, and is in the Congo. NATO is in Africa. NATO is in the Sahel. So the Soviet Union military threat doesn't exist anymore, but NATO still exists, and it's expanded its role. And its role is to put missiles and armaments and weapons on the borders of Russia, and Russia's not having it. And so this is what we have today. Now, the questions we need to ask, of course, is how is this going to affect us, the right wing in America, and especially people of African ancestry and African diaspora, because this is going to have a significant impact on all of us.
Right on. Would you like to add on Ajamu? Sure, what the
that was very, very thorough. I mean, the key points for me that helps to clear up some of the confusion that people have on this issue is that, sometimes we start with talking about the coup in 2014, which is important. That directly precipitates, where we are today. But as Dhoruba pointed out, this struggle in terms of the role of NATO, precedes that date. Basically, this is part of the reconfiguration of power relations in Europe, and part of that was the gradual expansion of U.S. influence, U.S. capital influence, trying to consolidate the gains that they acquired when the Soviet Union collapsed in the 1990s. So the whole area of struggle was around Eastern Europe. Not so much even a struggle, because U.S. capital was still hegemonic, it still is. But there was a sort of a gentleman's agreement, if you will, quote unquote, that allowed for European capital to get into the game in small ways around the new territories of Eastern Europe. But the objective of the U.S. has always been to maintain its hegemony in Europe, and that's what this thing is all about. It ain't about no human rights or even the sovereignty of Ukraine, because if the U.S. was concerned about the sovereignty of the Ukraine, they would not have overthrown a democratically elected government in 2014. When they overthrew that government in 2014, Ukraine lost its sovereignty. The government that's in place now is basically a U.S. puppet. Okay, so all this notion about this being some kind of conflict between democracy and authoritarianism, all this kind of stuff is all bullshit. And that's why we have to make sure our people don't get caught up in this, because you have a lot of folks out here confusing the people, trying to frame this in these moralistic terms. And the evidence is quite clear. Once you go beneath the surface, this is about power politics. This is about economic competition. This is about capitalism. This is about imperialism. And we've got to understand where our interests lie. Our interests don't lie being on the same side of expanding NATO, especially as we understand the role NATO's played not only in Europe, but on the African continent.
And I think it's very important to understand the options that the Russians actually have. The Ukraine is a highly divided ethnic enclave that used to be part of the Soviet Union, used to be a part of Russia. And when the Germans, Nazis, invaded Russia in the early 1940s, when they invaded Russia, the Ukrainians, many of them greeted them as liberators. So you have a long association of fascist ethnic elements in the Ukraine that have always been anti-Russian. And so they have found ready allies with the West, with the fascists of the West, with the imperialism of the EU, and they are the ones that benefited the most from that Orange Revolution. But we need to really understand something here. If for instance, we looked at what the U.S. is doing. They're arming the Ukraine. They're making a historically neutral territory on the borders of Russia, armed camp with weapons that could destroy and that could reach Russian cities. So the Russians are not having that. Just no way, the same way the U.S. wouldn't have Cuba, you understand, with Soviet missiles in place in it, and almost led to nuclear confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States in 1961. So we really need to understand why the Russians are reacting the way they're reacting, and so therefore, if we understand that, then we understand how that's going to play itself out in Africa. We understand how that's going to play itself out in the Mediterranean. We'll understand too how that's going to play itself out in this area of the world, and especially down there where Ajamu is at, down in Colombia and South America. So the ramifications of this confrontation, the ramifications of this, the constant use of sanctions by the U.S. because of their monopoly capitalism and their international finance capital leg up with their currency, their currency, which is actually worthless, but this currency is universally traded. So all of these banking arrangements and all of these financial dealings between governments, they ultimately transit through the U.S. finance capitalist system, and that's how the U.S. is able to exert these sanctions and use them as weapons of war, substitute war, because they're not going to put any boots on the ground in the Ukraine, because the Ukraine is of no strategic or significant interest to the United States at all. And if NATO did expand to the Ukraine, then under Article 5, I believe, of the NATO treaty, any attack on the Ukraine it means that all its NATO allies have to join in its defense. So Russians ain't having this. And so the purpose of Putin, I imagine, and realistically, is that to go into the Ukraine now is to make the Ukraine unserviceable and uneconomical to the West, basically to make it a failed state.
Right.
And then, y'all can deal with this if you want, but this state is going to stay neutral. You see? And it's not going to become pro-Western. It's not going to become a NATO member, and we're not going to tolerate that. And we'll disrupt the whole security apparatus of the EU, because we do got a beef with the Balkans, and we still got a beef with Georgia.
Right on. The Dhoruba, the only cat I know that get up in the middle of an interview, keep talking.
Oh, I forgot I was on screen, man. My bad.
Yeah, you think you just talking to me and Ajamu.
But it's I hope Africa's watching this thing, understand or see where we need to be at as a people, as a liberation movement, in terms of the kinds of analysis that we must have in order to make sure that we don't get caught up in the bullshit, that we don't get caught up involving ourselves in struggles that are contrary to our own objective interests. This kind of analysis and the connections being made, that reflects the kind of work that we all have to do to make sure that we understand all of these issues as they unfold. So this is part of the responsibility, I believe it is, to being a revolutionary. It requires constant struggle, constant engagement with materials, constant interaction with the people in order to make sure that you understand the objective realities that we face in both wherever you may be organizing, but also internationally. I mean, it's fantastic.
I'm glad you pointed it out, because there's so many folks that are talking about, why do Africans need to be involved, and it's the white man's war and so on and so forth. How do we respond to folks who are supposed to be somewhat considering themselves revolutionaries? How do we respond to that?
Let me give you an example. The EU and NATO are in Africa. They're in the Sahel. claiming they're fighting so-called Islamic jihadists. But the Sahel is one of the richest mineral regions stretching across Africa in the world. And they're buttressing up these coups, the coup in Mali, the recent coup in Sudan. All of these coups have been carried out by soldiers who were trained by the United States, who were trained by NATO, who operated in Afghanistan, who were on certain missions that were classified by the U.S. and their mercenaries, along with Zionists, along with the Israeli trainers and intel folks. So we need to understand that all this is all about the mineral resources in Africa. But look, what is the NATO doing in Africa? Given the history that I just ran down, and what is the EU? And the EU is comprised of all the former imperialist European nations that raped and dominated and still dominate Africa today. They're all EU members. Okay, so when we look at France's relationship in West Africa, what is their role? When you look at the United States' role with Africa, I mean, if anybody that's been following some of the videos and Zooms of PACA can tell you what is the EU doing, with Africa. How is NATO influencing all of these things? And one of the things that we begin to understand that these cell phones that we got, these Macs, these Apples, this stuff is made in China, and the strategic minerals needed to be put into these phones benefit the EU, benefit their economy, and benefit the development of their technology. So we need to understand that this stuff is what we're paying for. This is the same stuff that we need to communicate with each other. Okay, so it affects the market here. It affects the price of goods here, and seeing that we're all consumers and all of us are in debt to some degree, it's going to affect how we go about dealing with our own daily livelihood. Look at the cost of gas that's going up because of the Russian responses to NATO expansion in the Ukraine, and they're estimated to go up even further. So we need to understand too that these things affect us, and they affect the right wing here in America, who's calling for more militaristic and more violent responses to Russia. And so we know who these right wing elements are and where they stand with us. So where do we stand in relationship to them in this issue then?
Right on.
It's a constant struggle, trying to help people to understand that we are up against a global system. It ain't about you being in the U.S. and that's separated from folks in Colombia or folks in Guyana or folks in Ghana. We're talking about the continuation of a colonial capitalist order that began to develop as soon as these Europeans spilled out of Europe in 1492. That invasion and conquering of the Americas and the enslavement of African people provided the material base for what we refer to today as the so-called West. Those colonial relationships that were expanded and resulted in the global hegemony of Western European powers, they continue. Coloniality is not a fiction of the imagination. There's no such thing as post-colonial. The forms of domination have changed somewhat, but the structural relationships remain the same. So African people who are catching hell in the US, who have to deal with the domestic army that we refer to as the police, you can't disconnect that from the army kicking Africans in the ass on the African continent. Okay, it's the same source of white Western colonial capitalist power. Okay, so people have to understand that all this so abstract. I want to get free. We're gonna get free, and then you ask them, what do you mean by that? And they can't even answer. Some vague stuff about the white man or some bullshit. If we don't keep our analysis based in structured relationships, understand this fight is a fight for power. It's a fight for power in order to transform our conditions. That basically you bullshit. You might as well go ahead and join the NAACP or somebody and work for some reforms and quit twisting up your mouth and talking about you're revolutionary. Okay. So this is about having that kind of analysis we're talking about, but you don't get it overnight. You don't get it because you're angry and you say you love black folks and you read 2 books. That ain't enough. Okay. It requires, experiences, organizing. It requires patience with yourself and with our people. Okay. It requires humility. All right. Because being a revolutionary is a lifelong process. Okay. So yeah, we got to make those structural connections. When we created the Black Alliance of Peace in April of 2017, it was based on a very simple analysis that this global colonial capitalist order is on a decline, and that it was quite obvious to us, especially during the Obama administration, that the way that these white folks were prepared to maintain their global hegemony was through naked force. The smiling face of imperialism, the soft power generated by Barack Obama, it wasn't enough, especially when you look at the kinds of policies that they pushed. The Obama presidency may be the most violent 8 years in post imperialist history. Talking about the Second Imperialist War. So it became clear that So we said, look, we understand that the control and contain mechanisms for us, because we have become a redundant population economically within the U.S. And the assertion of aggressive military power outside the borders of the U.S. meant that basically it was going to be structural violence, and we had to be prepared. We had to make sure our people understood what was happening and make those connections between the local and the global. Again, understanding that this is a global fight that we're in. It's a fight to destroy this backward colonial capitalist white supremacist patriarchy. If you don't understand that, then you don't understand where we are today, and you don't understand your historical mission.
Right on. It feels good to be the mildest man on the screen today. You know what I'm saying? It's a it's a bad day in the U.S. I want to say you mentioned Obama, and there's folks like, well, what did Obama do? You know what I'm saying? He was, a black president, so on and so forth. What was Obama's role in this current conflict?
This current conflict, basically, they helped to create it. Obama's a pig, and basically what they did, and remember now, the front person, do y'all still hear me? Get out my screen. The front person for the Ukraine project was Joe Biden. It was the Obama administration that basically executed the coup in Ukraine. So they have, it's a continuation of U.S. policy. So who sits in the White People's House is irrelevant.
That's where Trump tried to flip that on his son, saying that he was dealing with corrupt elements in the Ukraine. You remember that phone call with Trump and trying to get something on Joe Biden's son. His involvement in the Ukraine was very significant. As vice president, though, Joe Biden, he was the architect of many of the so-called repressive law enforcement policies in the United States, the surveillance policies. He was one of the major architects of over-the-horizon, full spectrum presence, with U.S. military forces and paying these different corporations money to develop these predator and missiles and surveillance drones. We need to ask ourselves, what exactly does the does the billions of dollars that go to the Defense Department actually do for working people in the United States? We really need to ask that question, because somebody like Teledyne, they're making these drones that are meant to destroy and kill people. There's an entire industry, arms industry, that the United States is the #1 purveyor of on the globe, you know. And so when we talk about something as simple as gun control in the United States, you know, the arms, the gun industry, the gun lobby has absolute control over the Congress, over the legislatures, over the so-called lawmakers. Even though their union is their organization has NRA has been proven to be corrupt and riven through with white supremacists and racists. So we need to understand the relationship between the state and African people in the United States and the African diaspora is a direct relationship. And that relationship is reflected in U.S. foreign policy. The domestic white supremacy that the U.S. practices abroad, it inculcates and practices in the United States. This is the incubator for all of that. So we need to understand, just as Ajamu was talking about, the mess we can get out of young people today, building towards a real revolutionary development of working class and people and African people in the United States, is to build a real, genuine, anti-racist, abolitionist movement that does not deal with reform as the strategic vision or the end all of mass organization, and build a face-to-face relationship with ordinary people in the United States, ordinary African people who scuffling through these debts. And it's just, I mean, the rents on housing has risen 20% in the last few months, 20%. And we have the largest homeless population probably in the developed world. So we need we need to understand that this warlike economy, this type of geopolitics and empire that the United States is waging, takes money and resources away from the development in our communities, concrete development in our communities. And the militarization of the police is only the most blatant reflection of this, because it continues based on the plantation mentality of the racist militias that used to track down runaway slaves. Okay, so we are always under suspicion of being suspicious. You see, and the militarization of this is such that we know that many of the soldiers that come back to the U.S., many of the imperial stormtroopers that come back to the U.S. have a priority, a leg up on entry into local law enforcement. And so they come back with that mentality, they come back with that training, and we know the right wing has infiltrated law enforcement and the military extensively over the past 25 years, minimum. So we really need to understand what the ratcheting up of war abroad means to the militarization of police at home and increased surveillance of dissent in America. It has a direct impact, you see. And because we don't understand this, we don't take initiatives against the state that we, even within the realms of legality. Okay? We talk about
we don't even understand what the state is.
Absolutely, because that's why we come up with senseless slogans like defund the police. There's no national security state that's going to defund its armed agents. They're not going to do that. So for you to even make that proposal, it's ludicrous. It's a dead end. They're going to flip it on its head just like they did now. They make sure there's a rise in crime, and a rise in crime. They talk about gun violence, and they're going back to doing the same old shit that didn't work before, stop and frisk and all of this stuff again. You know, they're undermining reduction of sentences for certain things. And so we need to understand that the more the state is in a state of war, which is profitable to the capitalist system, which is profitable. the state of war is profitable to America. America has been at war for the majority of its existence. So we need to understand that these things have an effect on us, how we live, how we can move about, what type of freedom of speech we have, what type of economic opportunities we have, how we can travel and how we cannot travel. So all of these things affect us.
Right on. Ajamu, you want to add on?
Well, I just want to, I think that as we are moving toward making these connections to the broader issues beyond Ukraine, helping to contextualize Ukraine, before we move too far away, I wanted to just say a few last things on Ukraine, because, part of what we involved in, of course, is an ideological struggle, and an ideological struggle to try to keep our people aware of what we're up against, but an ideological struggle to try to move our folks back into the column with us who are trying to build movement to transform our conditions and to win power. And I say that because one of the consequences of the Obama administration was that he represents the consolidation of the process, the counter-revolutionary process that was intensified in the 1970s, a multi-pronged process in which one element of that was, in fact, the ideological and cultural element. One goal of that was to basically Americanize, in quotes, the African, okay? And so that process intensified and started in the 1970s, and there's a whole lot of different elements of that, including things like busing. The Obama administration really kind of, represented the solidification of that process, okay? So the result has been objectively, and we got to be, I think, is my opinion, upfront and honest about this, is that our people have been itching toward the right. Under the Obama administration, there was a dramatic shift to the right, okay? So we're trying to bring people back to in essence, sort of sanity, okay? And so what part of that is trying to create that psychological and emotional connection we used to have between ourselves and the state. There was a time that if you didn't know anything about U.S. policy, whatever, and you heard about a conflict the U.S. was involved in, and you were trying to figure out what was what and who was who, many of us would say, well, what side does the U.S. support? And whatever side the U.S. supported, we knew to support the other side, okay? That was that common sense.
That's true.
But today, you got people talking about us and our country and we and they ain't fighting the Cubans, now they're fighting the Russians on the side of the U.S. All of this is a reflection of the kind of transformation that's taking place in the consciousness of our people as the consequence of the cultural transformation. Amilcar Cabral talked about from his experiences. He talked about the weapon of culture and how even under colonialism, the people would retreat from colonialism to the extent that they can, and that their culture was a weapon that would at some point be transformed into a political resistance, okay? Because he said that the culture was basically it couldn't be defeated, okay? Well, I think Amilcar Cabral was incorrect on that. He couldn't see the kind of sophisticated ways in which this capitalist system can penetrate consciousness, can use culture as a weapon, can whittle down cultural resistance. And we saw that with our people. We saw that, because what happened in the 1970s, in my opinion, and going forward, was basically the same kinds of process we saw the indigenous people being exposed to or being subjected to with their boarding school processes, where they would take young indigenous kids and put them in these schools with the objective of killing the Indian. in order to save the man, as somebody said. So this thing with Ukraine, we have African people out here talking about, Russia and Putin and all of this. We've got to bring them back. And so one element I wanted to just say, and this is a long-winded way of getting to it, is this. We've got to delegitimize the Ukrainian government. This whole notion of them representing democracy is bullshit. We've got to show the connection between the phony fight that the Democrats are supposed to be leading here in the U.S. against the radical right, the extremist right, and the fact that this regime in Ukraine, this coup government, is a government riddled with extremist neo-Nazi elements. And anybody who argues that is an exaggeration, they're not being serious. Okay, in the first coup government, you had 4 ministers who were straight up Nazis. You had the Ajamu Battalion, who were the muscles of the right in Ukraine, who got incorporated into the Ukrainian National Guard back in 2014, and they're now being trained, or they were trained by the British on the front lines, on the contact line between Ukraine and the independent regions. You have the Speaker of their Parliament, straight up Nazi. The battalion, the commander of the Ajamu Battalion, I'm gonna quote this. He says, Ukraine's mission is to, quote, lead the white races of the world in a final crusade against the Semite-led subhumans. There's a Ukrainian word they use for that. That's what we're talking about. Okay. And Ukraine, what another thing people don't understand or don't know, since 2014, Ukraine became the epic center of the international white supremacist movement. You had something like 17,000 individuals from 50 different states, 50 different countries that went to the Ukraine to receive training, okay, military training, ideological training. From around the world. So how do you talk about you against Trump and the right in the U.S., where you are aligning with neo-fascists in Ukraine? Well, the answer is this. The Democrats, the Republicans, they have no hesitation in aligning with whoever they need to align with in order to advance their particular interests. There's no morality involved in this. It's straight up power. We've got to understand that also, all right? And not be confused. Not be confused by people telling us that we're supposed to be outraged because of what's happening with this military situation in Ukraine. And we ask the question, are you also outraged now, Africans, with what's happening with Putin? Where were you when we were trying to mobilize you to oppose U.S. policy in Ethiopia? Where were you when we were trying to help you to what was happening with Haiti? Joe Biden, one of the first things he does, he comes into office, is give the green light to Jovenel Moise, the puppet president in Haiti, whose time was up in Haiti, gave them the green light to continue and to suppress the opposition in Haiti. Where were y'all at then? It's like whatever the enemy puts on front of our faces, then that becomes the center of our attention, and we try to tell people, look, we've got to be more serious than that. We've got to center our interests and decenter Europe. Everybody's so upset about what's happening with this little bullshit war in the Ukraine because of why? Because it's in Europe. And they talked about, oh, this is so incredible. They want to alter the borders in Europe. Well, where was the opposition when Obama cut out a piece of the Sudan and they called it South Sudan? So we just have to be serious. Like what I was saying earlier, we've got to make these kinds of connections and struggle with our people, because if we can't build this revolutionary movement, as long as we losing people to the enemy.
Appreciate that. Definitely. Ajamu came through. I might have to call you Reverend Ajamu from now on, because you definitely came through dropping the gospel, according to Ajamu.
I get it from my teacher.
You get it from the teacher? Right on.
My teacher, Brother Dhoruba.
I don't think so. I hardly think so, bro. Yeah.
The Pope and the
I
Right
hardly
Reverend.
think so.
Hey, real quick. Okay, so yes, you broke that down. Right now, Russia being in the Ukraine, what does the Ukraine want from Russia? We know that Dhoruba mentioned the April 2008 Bucharest summit where Georgia and the Ukraine were both invited to join NATO, and basically Georgia got pumped up because they figured they'd be protected under Article 5 and that they go sell some wolf tickets and end up getting their ass whooped.
Stomped out.
Yeah, they got mushed. So right, they pumped them up to watch them get beat. So now you know what I'm saying. Now it's the Ukraine. What was that invitation about? Let's start with that. The invitation at Bucharest, was it an invitation to an ass whooping? And why was Russia against this the Ukraine being a member of NATO? I know there was multi-pronged, but
it was clear ever since the end of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet bloc nations that the last straw to the Soviet Union and its successor Russia was to allow itself to have armed hostile states with allegiance to the West on its borders. The same way the U.S. has declared the Monroe Doctrine in the Western Hemisphere. They will talk. I mean, could you picture the Chinese patrolling 12 miles off the coast of Florida, like the U.S. is doing now in the South China Sea? I mean, could you picture that? You could imagine these crackers if something. I mean, you couldn't even get a fishing trawler up in this bad boy.
Right.
You understand what I'm saying? So we really need to understand that the Russians, you know, whatever their faults as a nation state, and I'm sure Ajamu and I we have a whole litany about the role that the Soviet Union has played in buttressing the white supremacy of the West, even though it was supporting to certain degrees the armed struggles of decolonization. The parameters of the Cold War was such, and I don't want to digress, but the parameters of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States was such that it brought about the Bandung Conference. It brought about the non-aligned movement. You know, that the African people had to liberate themselves from the vicissitudes of colonialism and imperialism, and not substitute hegemony either from the East or the West. And we understood, if you look at the lectures and the responses in the Bandung Conference, we understood the nature of white supremacy, and we understood how it was integral to global imperialism. This was the people of color of the globe. Okay, go back to the Bandung Conference and the role that the African leaders and the Amilcar Cabrals and Eduardo Mondlanes and those who liberated Africa from the imperialists, you know. And I just want to say one thing about what Ajamu said about culture. Culture is an armament that people use to fight for their liberation. It allows them to pass on from one generation to the next the experiences and the radical histories and traditions of those who went before them. Because our culture is so assimilated and so much akin to the culture of the dominant white supremacist construct, it's very difficult for us to separate ourselves from that. And that's what Amilcar Cabral noted in an essay when he said, and I'm paraphrasing, that when the culture of the oppressed and the cultures of the oppressor are so similar to each other, it becomes almost impossible for the oppressed to liberate themselves from the oppressor. So he recognized the limitations of culture. And but I think that we could always point to what Mao Zedong said in Protracted War, that it wasn't the technology, it was the subjective factor in war that made the determination, the human factor. And this is something that we haven't identified with since the bullwhip days, because we were always told that if we resisted, if we stood up and we fought back, that we would be wiped out, that we would lose. And so that we devise all types of mechanisms and methods to get around standing up and dealing with these with these white supremacists and their violent state and policies and law and violence of culture and educational violence. We can't just interpret violence as being physical. You know, when you ravage the mind of a young black child or a young child of color, and you intimidate their soul and their spirit so that they never could become who they could really be, that's an act of violence to me. And so I think we need to understand. I think we need to understand exactly how the U.S. exploits abroad really affect us and impact on us, so that when we send these black Negroes to Congress, that they don't stand up and cheer the murder of Palestinian babies because they're in solidarity with the European settler state of Israel. Okay, because they want to fit in with the Democratic Party. The Democratic and Republican parties have never differed significantly on their foreign policies in the U.S. empire. They have both supported military blunders abroad, and they both can take the blame for the defeats that the United States has suffered at the hands of liberation movements over the past 50 years. So we need to be clear that we have to begin to think in our own interests, think in terms of our own power, the power that we could mobilize here where we're at in real time, in real space, to prevent those who don't mean us well, to prevent those who don't have our interests at heart, to prevent those from doing those things to us that threaten our survival and undermine the integrity of our humanity. And I think that we need to begin building those type of structures with an abolitionist movement, and an abolitionist movement that marshals the power of African people, first of all, into a third force, into a force that can determine our own policies, our own destiny, so that we don't deal within the strictures of the Democratic or Republican vultures. Wings of the vulture. So I'm just saying that. I mean, I'm done. I just think that we need to understand that U.S. incursions in Europe, the reason why NATO exists, the reason why the EU exists, is because of the U.S. empire and U.S. militarism abroad, and the U.S. and U.S. foreign policies. Because Europe has always been the focus of the U.S. primary view of global hegemony. The Europeans have always been the most important, but now China, with the rise of China, that's not going to be so. And when the U.S. pivots towards China, Europeans are going to fall to the bottom. Their interests are going to fall off, and so we have to prepare here in the belly of the beast for the deterioration of the so-called electoral process and the democratic dispositions of the right and left. We have to survive these extremes, and we have to forge ahead and build our own political presence and our own political power.
Right on. Ajamu, you had something to add on to that?
Well, no, I wanted to ask, as we continue the conversation. You referred a couple of times to this term abolition, and I'm just curious about that. I've always tried to understand what that really means, and I know it has to mean something coming from you other than some of the other articulations of it. And so I wanted to hear that, because there's that term I've seen used by folks who are very well-meaning. But when they talk about abolition, some of them have this position that they sort of extract from the state, the police institutions and the prisons, and suggest that to abolish those institutions are going to result in the kind of new dispensation of power and the possibility of creating a new society without, in fact, abolishing the state. I suspect that you of course you have a different perspective, but I wonder, that term. How do we make sure that even using that term doesn't continue to perpetuate what I think is a bit of confusion?
Mm-hmm. I got you. Absolutely. I agree. I agree with you. Yeah, it can be confusing. But I look at building an abolitionist movement as an interim struggle. As you know, Ajamu, we have not had a significant a movement in the United States for the past 50 years. And so that means that generations have been raised without a reference to their radical history. So what they're doing, and you can see it in front. I know I listen to you a lot, and I can see that although you try to remain focused and calm, I can see the frustration that these young folks are fighting battles that we already won. They're just reinventing failure. We already won this, and the states know how we won it because they got archives, they got a history. They go back into their own records. They see how we won voting rights. They see how we won. Why are we refighting every 4 or 5 years for the right to vote, or against amendments and deals to vote when all politics is local? Huh? If we even follow the so-called domestic colonization analysis that has been completely left out of any type of a debate about the how Black people should begin to think as a sovereign people rather than a national minority, rather than look at themselves as the first this and the first that every time white folks say, "Oh, ain't he wonderful?" Or ain't she, oh, this is Black girl magic. You see what I'm saying? And so, we clap, we applaud, and then, we go nowhere. So what I was getting at was that abolitionists, if we go historically into what an abolitionist movement was during the bullwhip days, we could see how it had an underground railroad. We could see how it forged alliances and networks with people who were in different levels and different class positions to influence people. We see how it organized itself on that level. But we also see that it didn't talk about reforming slavery. It didn't talk about reforming any of that. It talked about abolishing it. And so we're not talking about reforming police. We're talking about community control of public safety. You see, y'all want to use the term police? Y'all could use it all you want. We have to define the parameters of our own debate. We have to define the issues. And that's where these cell phones and this weaponization of data and this propaganda and the power of this main media has come in to dilute our message, to distract our people, to prevent people from having a face-to-face relationship. Ajamu knows because he's not a spring chicken, so he's been around long before the weaponization of data became the thing to do. You see, then we had to have a face-to-face relationship with people. We had to form alliances. We should have had a united front against fascism 4 years ago. You see? And this should have been a broad national united front. You see? And that could have morphed into a third party. That could have morphed into a whole different political force, because the rise of the right, the consolidation of white supremacy as the empire begins to suffer and take losses is becoming acute. And so our organization has to become acute. That's why I said abolitionist movement means that we're not going to reform shit. We're not even going to deal with the dialogue of what was passed for the left or right or neoliberal or neoconservative. We ain't with none of that shit. You know, this is how we envision our public safety. And this is what we're going to take to the masses of people to put on the referendums in our neighborhoods so that we control our own public safety officers, and we control who gets appointed or elected police chief and not the mayor. We get to control how policing is done in our community. In fact, we get to control what police live in our community. You see? And so that doesn't remove the power of the state. We know that the national security state and the garrison state, is looking at this as like, what? But this is a brilliant understanding that fascism or neo-fascism, or what I call democratic fascism in America, doesn't have a national police force. All fascist governments, when we looked at the past and historically, they were able to mobilize and politicize and take control of the national police force, whether it became the Gestapo, whether it became the Abwehr, or whatever the case may be. You see? They had national police, but America doesn't have national police. They have county police, they have local, they have town police, they have state police, they have they got school police. You see what I'm saying? So one of the things that Nixon said when he came to power, and he knew he had to mobilize, he had to get the right wing and law enforcement on the what would become the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, or LEA, and that began the real militarization of the police back in the early 70s. You see, right. So Nixon knew that he didn't have a national police force. So what did he do? He understood the power of the police unions and the political role that the police unions can play, and the money that he could funnel to police unions and police and local state agencies if they adhered to certain policies, or if they did. So when the war on drugs hit, they was off running, like they was all the races. You see, and so we really need to understand that as abolitionists, we could rethink our own immediate environment. We could talk about, we have to really take to heart that all politics is local, and have to understand that if we consolidate that local politics based on the fact that we are basically domestic colonies in many urban areas that we occupy, we fit the same parameters that you would use to define a colonized people. In terms of resources that's in our community, work that's in our community, the debt of those communities, the all of this stuff. You see, so if we understood community control as of public safety, decentralization of essential services that take place that our lives depend upon. That's what the Republican Party has been doing for the past 25 years, going into school boards, going into local administrations on the state level, going into licensing bureaus, and getting themselves in position so that they can determine who gets to vote, when they get to vote, and what policies get to be made. You see? And we've been asleep at the wheel on some democratic, lesser or two evil shit. We've been the crash dummies for the white supremacist culture, forever. You see? So that's what I mean by abolition, Ajamu. I mean it's an interim strategy to get people to rethink those agencies and those institutions that govern their immediate existence. We have to rethink the power of real estate owners in the Black community and what that means, which means we have to understand what gentrification actually is. and what type of capital it displaces, and where does that capital come from? You see, we have to understand that we have to begin to get our people to think as if we have to have our own best interests in hand. You see, and that comes with face-to-face relationships. We can't do this on the internet. We can't do it, with YouTube. You see what I'm saying? There is the digital divide, but there's a way that we could institute a whole campaign to break that digital divide in 6 months, right in the Black community. But we don't have the type of unity of those organizations in alliances like BACA or BAP, in broad-based alliances that understand the class differences between our allies and the transitory nature of the alliance. You understand what I'm saying? Because this alliance is only based on this particular principle, homeboy. And once we achieve this, we got to rethink this. You understand? Because a lot of stuff y'all done did I ain't with. You see what I'm saying? So I'm just saying that, that's what I mean by abolitionists. I mean that we need to raise a generation that's rethinking the power paradigm that we are in as a domestic colony, as not just as a minority who are a national minority who are basically American. So we're Africans in the diaspora, and this is our diaspora.
I want to ask a question because of the fact that there are folks, when you say a united front against fascism, that require clarity. How important is the united front against fascism, and how do we connect that on the international level?
Well,
who's that to?
To both of you. I mean, you know what I'm saying? I want both of y'all to rhyme on it. If you want to get started, Ajamu, and we pass it back to D, that's cool.
I like to jump on that first and let Ajamu deal with this and take it from there, because he's more pragmatic on what's real right now and what's not. You see what I'm saying? Because all that's not real is camouflage. All that's not real is camouflage, brother. So I just wanted to say that the United Front Against Fascism, the idea and the concept I had, was initially done by the Black Panther Party in 1969, right? And what happened was the Black Panther Party was under this extreme attack by law enforcement. The anti-war movement had ratcheted up to the fact where radical left from SDS had broke out on the campuses, and they were taking over campuses and all of this stuff. And so the pushback against this, of course, was the police began to increase their leverage with the state, their cooperation with the federal government. Like some of us, like myself, we were in the Black Nationalist Photograph album, which was circulated to local law enforcement around the country by the FBI under COINTELPRO, so that if we showed up in any city, crackers could identify us, because all niggas look alike. So they had the Black Nationalist Photograph album. Then they had the Agitator Index. That was basically somebody like Ajamu who could talk real slick, could talk real fly. Yes, they used to follow him around and buzz him and follow and try to jam him up for the smallest thing. You understand what I'm saying? The smallest thing. You see, and so if that didn't lead to a confrontation, that we had to go to a funeral. You see what I'm saying? And so we called together the left at this time in America, and that consisted of the anti-war movement, which is mobilized the white middle class and academia. That included the hippies. That included Black radicals. That included everybody who understood that the consolidation of right-wing racist power in America was a threat to all of us. We had movements in Detroit like Atrium that were working with the Detroit auto workers. We had Jesse Gray's movement in New York that were working with tenants. that this was one of the most massive and effective tenants' rights movements urban city had seen. A movement led by Jesse Gray in New York in the 60s when the UFD and all of them went on strike. And New York was in the throes of community control struggle. So there's an experience that we have with why we called the United Front Against Fascism at that time. I know. And so what we did is we called together all these organizations. And over 7,000 activists showed up. Most of them were white radicals, okay, and showed up. And they showed up from different cities across the country. And so we organized that into what we call National Committees to Combat Fascism, that they would go back to their cities and they would organize for simple programs like decentralization, community control of police, that they would begin to monitor the police, that they would begin to go to the people and try to mobilize the people around how they could take control of certain basic issues in their community, whether it was on the community public safety board or whether it was in the school. Okay, so I think we established something like 22, 21 chapters of the NCCF around the country called the National Committees to Combat Fascism, and they were under the discipline of the Black Panther Party. Okay, so many of these chapters were attacked like they were chapters of the Black Panther Party, but they weren't. National Committees to Combat Fascism, and the point of this was get the idea and notion, the consolidation of corporate wealth and the state constituted the beginnings of a fascist, authoritarian, anti-democratic process. And that Black Panther Party, we were at the head of the game because we had an underground. We believed in armed resistance to white supremacy and the state. We had a cadre organization, so we were in the position to call this national front, and people responded because we were being repressed, and we were in, and the polls that were taken. The Panther Party was quite popular in the hood amongst African people. You see, in fact, one poll I saw, it was 1970, I think, had the Black Panther Party. It was an ABC or NBC poll or something. Had the Black Panther Party one of three of the most respected organizations in the Black community by Black people. And the other two were nonviolent reformist organizations. Mm-hmm. You see? So that showed you right there the breadth of how Black folks saw our struggle. You see? They always said, man, I can't, God bless, King and all them, but them Panthers don't take no shit, man. you see what I'm saying? So that they always felt that. You see? So when we talk about the abolitionist movement, we have to talk about, too, the abolitionist movement building networks for our survival, for its ongoing political work. And that's cultural. And that's political, and that's economic, right in the community. You see, and so I think that's what I mean, Ajamu, by abolition movement right now as an interim methodology or strategic vision of struggle that's anti-racist, uncompromising, and non-reformist. Whatever reform the enemy proposes, we oppose. Whatever they oppose, we advocate.
my kind of family. Ajamu, you want to?
No, I think I think that the definition of what a united front against fascism might look like. I think that example is quite important. The challenge we have though today, and even a few years ago, you said a few years ago, probably connected to the rise of Trump. The issue we have is that how the subjective transformation of radicals and radicalism, that basically you could build or suggest a united anti-fascist front in 1969, 1970. And the range of opinion, of politics, would be somewhat more, I think, dramatically more narrow than it would be today. That even people who might define themselves as liberals back in those days, you know, today would be considered, you know, on the left, maybe even the damn to the far left. Okay, so if we call for a united front, you know, because of the relative confusion even around what in fact is fascism, because people think the fascism is something that just started, you know, with Donald Trump, and you know, we understand
That's
the
right.
broader definition you laid out, and even in terms of how fascism has been implemented and experienced. You know, we go back to the beginnings of the Europeans spilling out of Europe. That the practices that were created and imposed on people to provide the material basis of this thing called Western Europe. We call those colonialism was fascism. Okay, the relationships, the behaviors, the class sort of relationships and structures, and then you look at the South. You know,
That's
one
right.
party domination under racist terror,
feudal chattel slavery,
feudalism.
yeah,
Exactly. So fascism is nothing new for us, but it got transformed. It got extracted from its kind of a historical and structural understanding under when Trump came into some kind of behaviorist kind of bullshit. You know,
well,
I
that's
tell
the
people,
propaganda.
yeah,
That's
that's
the
totally. I said
propaganda,
you
man.
watch too. I said you all been watching too many bad Hitler movies. Okay, it ain't
Yes.
about behavior. It's about the structure, the class structures. Okay, so they got you all focused in on the clownism and theatrics of Donald Trump. You all looking over here, and the neoliberal fascists, the neoliberal right wing, the ones that control the state. They moving to consolidate and deepen their power with no opposition. Okay, so we come to the left and we talk about we want to build an anti-fascist movement, and the first thing everybody thinks about, oh, we talking about anti-Trump. No, we ain't talking about anti-Trump. Okay, dump Trump and all that kind of bullshit. You know, so we would have to engage in this internal, deep, eternal struggle, even among so-called left forces. Because even today, you know, people talking about, you know, I was talking with a brother who wrote a, you know, very interesting piece and laid out a scenario that's going to happen next few years. And by 2024, the radical right under Trump is going to control the House, the Senate, government positions on the state level, and the White House. And then in 2025, they're going to impose fascism. I'm like, huh? That's illogical. I mean,
Crazy shit in
if
the world.
they already control all these institutions under the guise of so-called democracy.
That's why I call it democratic fascism. That's why I call it democratic fascism. See, this is why. See, that's why I wanted you to follow up behind me so you could actually show and say, "Look, man, you talk about a united front today. This is what we're looking at." You see,
right.
See, that's why I say, you know, right on, black man. So what we're looking at is what we're looking at here when we talk about a united front. The internal struggle that you indicated that we would have to go through to maintain the alliance, to maintain the front, means that the principles have to be so singular that the only organizations are only going to sign on out of desperation, which means
or political clarity.
Well, that's preferred, you know, because with desperate, you just have to know the limitations. With those with political clarity, they're ready to go the whole nine. You see what I'm saying? So right. Yeah. But what I'm saying, you absolutely right. And the internal struggle, you know, if gotten out of hand, would preoccupy everything. You see? So the only thing that I could think of that will really solve this problem, you have to pick these brothers and sisters out in the organizations. And when we do the alliance, and this organization say, well, we'll commit to data transcription. You understand that we create a common database and communications thing. And the other organizations say, okay, we'll do the written stuff and stuff. And you see what I'm saying? We all share our little tasks, and we have our little campaign that we're going to go through for the next 6 months or whatever. That's when we take these Negroes and we ship them out. Literally, you pick them up and you put them someplace else. I'll tell you, it works.
I appreciate your code.
I'm telling you, you know why it works? Because they feel such a need to communicate. They feel such a need to fit in where they at. They feel such a need to, goddamn, I'm not in familiar. I got to make these new, connections, and I got to really do my job here, because that's how I get connected. You'd be surprised.
Mm-hmm. Right on.
That's why you see, that's what the Army does, right? Once they train you, they tell you, you're shipping out tomorrow. Where am I going? You're going to Afghanistan. Say, damn, Afghanistan. You understand what I'm saying? So that's what they do. You get all comfortable and familiar, and you got all your stuff down pat. You see what I'm saying? They say, man, you're doing a wonderful job here, son. You're doing a great job here. I'm gonna send my recommendations along with you. You're gonna say, sir, I'm going somewhere. Oh yeah, you're going to Sri Lanka in the morning. So that's what we got to do when we get these young brothers and sisters on board and get them in the network. We just got to shuffle them around, man. We got to get them in environments that instill creativity and connections with them.
Exactly. That's the only way people develop. And that's why building these independent organizations is so incredible.
Which brings me to what you were saying, about how do we deal with forging alliances with fraternal movements and international alliances, and which are increasingly difficult under the so-called rules of the war on terror, which makes, which can interpret any liaison with somebody that's on their shit list, as supporting terrorist organizations, and thereby bringing us into libel as U.S. citizens, et cetera, et cetera. And so we know organizations are vulnerable to this now. So how do we create the type of public and above board alliances, functional alliances that could result in, real solidarity with movements, and that's been my concern living in Africa for a minute, and although I think that the door is wide open for that in Africa right now, I think that there's the level of as Ajamu was pointing out, the level of confusion, that exists. Like he was talking about, so how are they going to interpret fascism? They're going to interpret fascism as this and that. And so we got to we got to have a consciousness raised and struggle with them. Might last 6 months. Mm-hmm. You understand?
Well, let me share, I think, a concrete example of what that challenge you just proposed in terms of how do we build these transnational African structures, revolutionary structures. And I think, and you said two terms that I think we have to embrace when we do this, and we're doing it, is above board and public. But that doesn't mean that it can't have a radical content. And so, for example, we got this shut down AFRICOM campaign, bringing attention to the existence of this U.S. command on the African continent. So, we built a U.S. out of Africa network, and we got now over 500 members from 4 different continents with a substantive element on the African continent. Now, we understand it ain't just about AFRICOM, because AFRICOM couldn't exist on the African continent without the collaboration of these neo-colonial criminals. So AFRICOM becomes the entry point for us to deal with U.S. Presence, but also to begin to deal with the issue of neo-colonialism on the continent, okay? And that is the entry point. That's the way you start building these structures, you know? And be it AFRICOM or be it the struggle against economic and debt or whatever it may be, we got to build those structures, you know, step by step, and with an ideological tightness that we may have not had to think about 30 years ago. 30 years ago, we could afford broad structures, and then through struggle, you narrow and all of that. I think the objective conditions today is such that anything we build now has got to be crystal clear in terms of its politics and where we're trying to go. Because the enemy is even more aggressive today in some ways than before, even though it hasn't manifested itself in the same kind of ways yet. But, you know, right now we can't play, we don't have time to play with certain things. We got to be absolutely politically clear, ideologically clear, unambiguous in terms of the terms we use and concepts, so that people are absolutely clear about what they are committing to in terms of any kind of organization that we build. So, you know, that's how we began to address this issue of building these international structures. We talk about Africa. We're doing the same thing with Latin America. You know, we got this Haiti Americas Committee where we are building relationships with organizations throughout the Americas with the sole intent of confronting U.S. imperialism in the Americas. So it's a process, and other people doing it too. But, you know, it's a process of systematic discipline organizing.
Right on. Man, we got a couple more questions. I know D has to run.
Yeah, I really hate to bounce right now, but my ride is right downstairs.
Right on.
And yeah, man. So Ajamu got this, man. You know, we could finish up, man. That's why I wanted you to follow up, man, because we could talk some more about that too, especially about the apparatus in Africa, because I think that Africa, young folks is ready to come forward because the political elite that's there right now, they have proven themselves to be totally avaricious and you know, they're just ridiculous, man. And the gap between rich and poor is growing at a phenomenal rate, you know. And if you look too, we have black folks coming to Africa and repatriating and stuff, and then buying land and making moves and stuff. So there's a lot that we could really put together, I think, much faster over there than we can over here, because over there, at least, you know, we have a little more juice and more sympathetic ears in positions of power. Because in Africa, it's not who you know that counts, it's who knows you. So that's what's happening, you know. So yeah, man. So listen, I gotta really run out. I want to pick up on the rest of this, but I really appreciate you. I really appreciate you, bro, and being able to chop it up with you. And I thanks Kalonji for giving me the opportunity to talk with my long admired comrade here. You know, and we're gonna kick it some more, because I'm not going nowhere. I'm in New York for a minute, and so we're talking.
It's been good.
Yeah, we'll put together a part two.
Yeah, and watch your back down there, man. You know,
I'm trying to, brother. I'm trying to. I got you.
All right, peace.
All right, brother. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Downstairs.
Peace. That was Dhoruba.
He didn't turn it off.
You know how he do. You know what I'm saying? Definitely you know, salute to him for coming through at his you know, his 2 cents. I was gonna tell him part of my spiel in the beginning was gonna be that you know, known both of these brothers for quite a while, and one of them is giving me the majority of my gray hair. So I'm not gonna give you that joint just yet. But you know, definitely shout out to shout out to D for his analysis. I want to continue because of the fact that and we can you know, if we have a few minutes, whatever, before we wrap up. If you you know, we started off talking about what was going on in the Ukraine and you know, Russia. I mean, Russia and the Ukraine. I want to you know, I want to skip a little bit because we talked about some of this last time, but I want to talk about the connection strategically to what's going on in the in so-called quote unquote Latin America right now. You know what I mean? How that what impact would this particular conflict have on some of the countries in that particular region?
Good question. You know, one of the things that's going to happen, I think, our brother Dhoruba referenced it once, is the impact of energy prices. That this conflict is going to result in gas prices going through the roof. One of the unforeseen consequences, though, in terms of Latin America, might be a loosening of the sanctions regime on Venezuela. Because even though if earlier the U.S. imperialist strategy was to take offline Iranian oil, Venezuelan oil, okay, to basically help to maintain and drive up the prices. But with the prices now up at a point where you have this massive inflation issue, there may be the counter pressure now to start relaxing some of these sanctions and allowing for more Iranian oil and Venezuelan oil to come online, especially with the real possibility of additional sanctions that would take oil from Russia offline. So that has to be replaced some kind of way. Okay, so that is something we have to watch very clearly. But in terms also of the politics, we know that, for example, Venezuela supported what was happening with Ukraine and Russia. We know that the Cubans and the Nicaraguans recognized the two new regions as independent states, and there's going to be implications for that from U.S. Imperial policy. And we also know that what is also becoming quite clear to people is that the U.S. is not in a place to be able to impose itself on everyone else as effectively as it has been in the past. And that's reflected in the shift politically back toward the left that we've seen in the last couple of years. We might recall that, you know, the so-called pink tide, I hate using that term, that swept across Latin America was pushed back as the consequence of intensified U.S. subversion and destabilization a few years ago. Again, beginning really under the Obama administration. You know, that Obama administration, I don't think people understand. This is one of the most criminal regimes, maybe in the history of the U.S. It's
smooth criminal, right?
It's crazy as what that might sound like, yeah. But that subversion intensified under Barack Obama. He's the one that characterized Venezuela as a extraordinary threat to national security. You know, right. But there's been in the last 2 years a shift back. I predicted that was going to happen. I said that when the shift takes place the next time, the tide won't be pink. It's going to be red.
That's right.
Okay. So we are seeing that happening even in a place like Colombia, where there's a possibility of a left coalition taking the presidential position and even some congressional spots. And so you had a return, you had a reversal in Bolivia, Argentina to a certain extent. You got this what is questionable happening in Chile. Possibility that Lula's coming back in Brazil. I think they're going to come back in a different kind of way. They're not going to be as subservient to neoliberalism as it were the first time around. You got Venezuela still standing strong after years of attempts to try to undermine their process. You got the Cubans, of course, continuing. You got Nicaragua and the successful election in Nicaragua. You have a very important election that just took place in Honduras, another reversal of a U.S. Supported coup that resulted in a bunch of African people dying as a consequence of the coup in 2009, where they put in a fascist government that then started targeting Garifuna and other Black folks in Honduras to get them off their lands. So we're seeing this inevitable historical shift taking place in the Americas. And what's important about that too is we talked about this a little bit the last time we talked. I think the popular movements in Latin America are some of the most people here are thinking about the revolutionary process in different ways. The Africans in Colombia, for example, it ain't about just seizing power, it's about transforming relationships. They center what we refer to as territoriality.
Right.
This interconnection between the people and culture and land. They talk about how important land is as a way in which you perpetuate the culture. They have been organizing production in their territories in a communal way from the time that they've been there. Right. Many people on this call are familiar with Francia Marquez, who's running for president in the primaries. Sister African, so we go back years. We helped raise Francia. Okay, now she's running for president. Her village, La Toma, they established that in 1636. So the kind of continuity of these Africans down here. When you come to Colombia, people don't even know this. Colombia has the third largest grouping of African people outside of Africa. Number one, you got Brazil. Number two, you got Africans in the U.S. And number three, you got Colombians. So this is vitally important for us to be aware of, support the struggles here in this country also. And Colombia is Colombia is an associate member of NATO. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Why you got an association in Colombia? And was talking about trying to do the same thing with Brazil. Why? Because NATO is a white supremacist imperialist instrument. Okay, that's why it's absurd for any African to find themselves on the same side supporting NATO. So yeah, this is what's happening in Latin America, but and it's significant. Haiti is also key. We talked about that last time. We've got to understand and support the struggles in Haiti. All of these are linked. We need to build all of these connections organizationally, and remind our people in North America, you part of the Americas, okay? And break down this U.S. centrism where you can be a radical in the U.S., and that's a mumbling word about U.S. imperialism.
Right.
You think that the U.S. is the world, okay? No. And you don't have no, you don't have no corner on what's supposed to be black and blackness. Not anymore, definitely not anymore, because I think sometimes African people in the U.S., they may have displaced some of these crazy French Africans as the most European Africans on the planet. And that's understandable. I'm not condemning, it's understandable. The colonial process has been heavy. Right. That's why we got to win our folks back.
Right on. Appreciate that. I want to ask you one more question before we let you roll. Seeing that Western Empire is is nervous, for lack of better words. You know what I'm saying? Seeing that they are in dire straits. How likely is it, in your opinion, that there with Biden selling wolf tickets and NATO's being a running dog for the U.S., how likely is it that there would be an international war, a World War III type situation?
I think I think that's a little unlikely. I don't think there's going to be a confrontation in that way. And even though we were concerned about, people raised the issue of the possible nuclear confrontation between the U.S. and Russia, it was never going to really get to that point. What's more likely, what is happening right now, is this increasingly aggressive stance on the part of the U.S. and Western Europe, using a military-first strategy to try to maintain their global hegemony. And what that means is a continued subversion, undermining democratic processes around the world, and using the weapon of sanctions to give themselves a comparative advantage economically. Increasingly referring to this so-called international rules-based order, but the rules they talk about are their rules and not international law. So that's going to be, and then having to try to manage their own internal contradictions as a consequence of the crisis of capitalism and the crisis of legitimacy in their countries. One of the things that we argue that we have to be aware of with this whole Ukrainian manufactured crisis is that this was a classic wag the dog situation. That, to shift attention away from the miserable and pathetic domestic policy of the Biden administration, this war shit. And we talked about Russia, and we ain't talking about the fact that we got expanded the numbers of people who are homeless, and people who are because of being thrown out of their houses. So all the domestic stuff we can talk about, all this, and the crimes against humanity occurring as a consequence of the state not having in place the mechanisms and structures to provide medical assistance, medical care. Okay, so it's going to be more of that, and the response from the state is going to be more intense repression, and they're already setting us up with that pig in New York, Eric Adams. They're giving all this ink to to lay the ideological foundation for a new war on crime. And you saw that they had the other Reverend Pig, Sharpton, playing the same role that folks played, 30 years ago, providing an ideological cover to the war on crime back in the 1980s. People forget about that. In the 1980s, 1990s, it was these petty bourgeois pigs who were providing the ideological cover for cracking down on crime. So people talk about Biden and the crime bill of 1994.
Predated.
Black leadership class are the ones that beg massive Biden and the rest of them for the bill.
That's right. That's right. Hey man, definitely appreciate you. And in the spirit of who I am, I'm gonna hit you with one more last question. Will Russia wreck the Ukraine? Because it seems that we know that the U.S. is trying to move in, NATO is trying to move in. They're talking about the whole invasion, so on and so forth. What do you think the end game that Russia's looking for in the Ukraine right now?
I don't believe. I mean, even though it's clear that there's military actions taking place across Ukraine, I don't believe that they are going there. The end point or the objective is to take hold of Ukraine. You all might remember back when the first Bush administration went into when they ejected Saddam Hussein from Kuwait and had the Iraqi army on the run, and people were saying, y'all had them on the run, but you didn't go into Baghdad and take it. And Colin Powell responded that if you break it, you own it. And they had enough foresight to understand, we don't want this headache. We don't want to take Iraq. The Russians don't want the Ukraine. they already have going to be facing some severe economic issues with all these sanctions and stuff being imposed on them. The Russians aren't a super rich nation. They have their GDP is about equal to Texas. Okay.
Right.
So now I think what they're going to do, I think the military actions across the country was to basically degrade the ability of the Ukrainian defense forces to put military pressure on the Donbass region. So they are doing that. They are destroying military ammunition depots. They've destroyed the Ukrainian Air Force. They have eradicated any air defense systems they have in Ukraine. They are going to impose a ipso facto military neutralization on Ukraine by destroying their military. And I think they're going to pull back if they're wise. They're going to pull back and just maintain their forces as protective units in the so-called Donbass. I don't think they want to go in and bring back Viktor Yanukovych, who was deposed in 2014. I mean, it would be an interesting move if they did that. But what that would do, Brother Kalonji, is that it would mean that they will be seen as occupation forces, and they'll have to, in fact, occupy in order to protect whatever regime they put in place. So I think they're going to pull back, and then there's going to be discussions. Already started today. The Ukrainians have said, can we talk to the Russians?
Right.
And they responded. The Russians responded and said, "Yeah, y'all want to talk now? Okay, we talk. What we're going to talk about is Ukrainian neutrality."
Right.
So now the Ukrainians are considering that. If they were free and were really sovereign, they might talk about that, because it's clear that the strategy that the U.S. imposed on them to try to pretend like they're going to take back the Donbass by military force, it was a failure.
Right.
And if they wise, they will understand that basically, they got to triangulate. They've got to have a relationship with the West, because that's what they are oriented toward. But they also gonna have to have a relationship with Russia. That's in their backyard. Okay.
Right.
So that's going to be a response, and I think there's going to be a Ukrainian government. There will still be a puppet U.S. government, but they're going to be severely restrained now in their ability to pose a military threat to Russia.
Right on. Hey man, Revolutionary Love Ajamu. Appreciate you coming on. I mean, I was trying to get you on for like 17 years, and finally we got you. twice in 2 weeks.
In a row.
You know what I'm saying? Back to back. Definitely, man. Appreciate you and Dhoruba.
I appreciate you, brother, and thank you for letting me come through. I really appreciate this opportunity to be on the show with brother Dhoruba.
Right on.
One of my heroes also. So let's keep on doing this work, man. This is a very interesting and complex historical moment. I really appreciate you bringing the opportunity to the people to hear and to discuss these very, very important, complex issues. So thank you for your work.
Right on, brother. Nah, we together on this track, as they say, and we will win. So definitely appreciate you, and our home is your home. You know what I'm saying? So anything you need, from us, definitely, you know how to get it. So
I appreciate it.
I appreciate
no compromise, no retreat.
Man, look here, man. War without terms. We know what it is. Right on.
All
right, brother. Salute. Right. Yes, sir. He's checking out. This is a powerful piece. What y'all think? You know what I'm saying? This is I'm honored to be a part of this discussion because of the fact that I respect both of these brothers' work. And it's a wonderful thing. It's always refreshing. Of course, I've been working with Dhoruba for at least a decade and a half, traveling and getting headaches and all that type of stuff. But it's always great to hear one of my my OGs, drop that information. And same with Ajamu, just really providing a clear analysis and not compromising their position. So that's always a wonderful thing. And I want to point out, because someone asked me the other day, why do I call my elders OGs? When we say OGs, we're talking about original guerrillas. You know what I'm saying? We're not talking about original gangsters. So, let's dead all that. The only gangsters we know is the government. You know what I'm saying? Dead Prez used to say revolutionary but gangster. We say revolutionary's been gangster. You know what I mean? So, definitely shout out to our, original guerrillas and all our veterans out there. All we ask is you continue to support our efforts and our work. I know for a fact that it is an honor for me to be here as a not only a co-founder of Black Power Media, but just to have the opportunity to bring on folks who I know have been marginalized and are denied access to the right people. So definitely we support you all. We've been seeing the super chats and the resources that came through today. Definitely we appreciate that, because of the fact that we need to keep this movement moving. If you have it in your soul, in your heart, and in your pockets, definitely support our Patreon at our Black Power Media, blackpowermedia.org, and let's stay on top of the world, stay ready for revolution in this war without terms. Riot Starter TV, Black Power Media, we out. Peace, y'all.